Hi, everybody. My name's Steve Winterfeld. I'm the advisory CISO at Akamai. A little bit about my background. I have been the CISO for Nordstrom Bank, run a lot of Nordstrom's security infrastructure, worked at Charles Schwab where I built out threat intelligence and the incident response programs. And what I wanted to do today is take some time to share my experience around using frameworks. And so a little bit about what a framework is designed to do. We're really here to say that I want to leverage other people's experiences. I don't want to make my own mistakes. I want to use industry best practice. These are great in situations, we'll go to the far extreme. Worst case, you've had a data breach. You're involved in a class action lawsuit. If you're in a regulated industry, you're talking to the regulators. And so you want to say, I didn't make this up on my own. I followed regulations or audit practices or industry best practices, and you're in a much more defensible position. On the far other end of that scale, you want to do the right thing for your customers and for your leadership. And so again, we want to take that experience and leverage it. Ultimately, we don't want to use the framework to build our security program. We want to have a security program that is compliant by the very nature of how good our program is, and it can be used as validation. But when designing that program, these are some great references. So the two that are probably the most popular is ISO and Nist. And we'll talk a little bit more in detail about these, but essentially ISO is saying, this is the management system. Nist is saying this is a set of best practices, standards, and recommendations. And so once we have these kind of goals of we want to build a program, then we need to say, okay, to do that, we need to have the documentation. So we're going to build our policy, and our policy may say we'll follow the following guidelines or standards or processes. Not so much tools, but that high level guidance. And then a plan, how you're going to execute that goal. And then each layer of your documentation gets more specific and at some point almost becomes a checklist. So let's jump right into some of the more onerous compliance or regulations. So we'll start off with one of the industries that's heavily regulated. I'll first start off with kind of more of a US focus. So with the United States, a bunch of different federal regulators exist, and they've all consolidated their regulations around FFIEC. If you're publicly traded, you might have Sarbanes-Oxley. And these are just things that the federal government is going to come in and inspect. And then again, in the states, every state may have financial laws. Right now, the ones that are probably the most difficult or the highest requirements are the New York Department of Financial Services regulations. And that ties to Wall Street. In the EU, we kind of have open banking, which hasn't caught on as much today in the United States. But that regulation that says, if I belong to a bank, some of the new high fintech apps that I want to use for payments or tracking or whatever apps I want to use, I have to be able to use that in conjunction with my money in a typical EU bank. And so these are all highly regulated and constantly evolving. State laws are constantly evolving. Then international laws. India has moved forward with laws for protecting its people, and we'll talk next about protecting privacy. New Zealand, Russia. Some of these are also getting very much into geofencing. And so trying to not only protect the data, but manage where it's taken care of. The next set of regulations we'll look at is around privacy. So, again, focus on Europe, but this is as you can see in the map down there, and if you can't read it, the red is heavily regulated, orange is robust, yellow is moderate, and green is limited. And so these exist across the world right now. A couple examples in Europe, they are saying that the laws of Europe apply to wherever that data is going. So if you're going to have a customer in, Spain, that customer's data in, let's just pick India, has to be regulated by the EU standards, not India standards. Another example where it gets more complicated is, you have federal laws, but then you have those sub laws. In the United States, it would be a state law. And recently, California came out with Ccpa, which really is similar in a lot of ways to GDPR, but the nuances that make it hard to operate because, for example, in California, you have to opt out. In Europe, you have to opt in. And so the nuances in how it's different for every geography you're serving becomes complicated quickly. And then just another example, a lot of that we're talking about there is around commerce. If you switch over to, your health information, then different countries are regulating that in different ways. And so depending on your industry, what privacy regulations are impacting you could be different. And so it's just something to pay attention to. But again, those federal regulations around banking, the privacy regulations are great examples of best practices. So even though you may not be required to do them, it may be a practice you want to look at to see how people are doing that so you can protect your customers or your employees to the best of your abilities. So switching from, mandated over to some organizations that have put out frameworks that I really find useful. So this first is from a US organization called MITRE. It is a not-for-profit organization, and if you ever have looked at your CVEs for vulnerabilities, MITRE started that program, so you've probably heard of them. So they have a couple things. The first is they've tried to categorize all the different attack vectors in attack methodology. So there's over 200 of these cataloged. Now, I don't expect anybody to be able to read that chart by any means. It's just an example to show you how complicated it is. And so if you want to say, how mature is my security operations center? This is a great framework to measure that maturity. You can go in and say, okay, for this attack vector, have I had my pen test team check out all these different ways to break into the network? And then you can quantify whether or not you've validated each one of those. If you're in kind of a SCADA industry, have OT network, then there's also one for an industrial control systems that's focused on their unique challenges versus a typical network. And then finally, they put out the common attack pattern. And this is, we talked about measuring the maturity of your SOC would be done with the attack framework. Measuring the methodologies of your penetration testing team or your red team would be done with this common attack pattern. And so these are great resources for quantifying a couple areas that we've always had difficulty measuring. So it's certainly something worth looking at. But again, as you can see, it's something you're going to have to prioritize. With over 200 of these, you're going to have to look at your business model and figure out which one of these are most applicable as you try to go through this, because that's a lot of work. Next, there are a lot of analytical organizations, Forrester, Gartner, I could go on. I want to touch on the fact that they'll often produce these guidelines or the ability for you to go out and use their processes or their frameworks. So one that's been around for about 10 years is Zero Trust. That's that concept of, not having a crunchy exterior and a soft interior, great in a candy bar, bad in a network. You want layers of defense. You want the endpoint protected. You want situational awareness of all that activity. And so Zero Trust is moving away from don't give somebody access to the network and then trust them throughout it. Really kind of hone down that Zero Trust and make them validate for everything they need. Of course, the balance here is we want to avoid complexity. Complexity is the enemy of security. And we want to avoid friction. Whenever we enter too much friction into our security, the users are going to find workaround, and those workarounds often create backdoors that we didn't intend. But Zero Trust is a great concept to move forward. And although it's 10 years old, they constantly are publishing new updates for it. Another one that came out last year is SASE. That's the diagram down below. I really like that diagram in that it's got both a protect and perform aspect. And so you want to make sure that you're tied closely. I'll talk about an example. Had my security plan all laid out, only to be told a bunch of the stuff I was protecting was going to move to Google Public Cloud. So now I had to suddenly re-architect everything. By staying, protect and perform closely tied together, and then moving that protection out to the edge, it's just a great framework to build your strategy around. I wouldn't necessarily look them for the specific capabilities listed, but more for the concepts and the kind of capabilities that you need to apply to yours. Gartner has a larger umbrella continuous adaptive risk and trust assessment capability. That hasn't caught on quite as much as far as I'm aware, but again, worth looking at if you want a broader, more umbrella strategy. Stamp is great. I've seen people using that. Another, if you want to go more towards the business side, it originally was technology, or was originally total cost of ownership. Lately, more of your CFOs are talking about technology business management. If we're going to be successful in convincing the CFO to, give us the budget we need to secure the network, we need to speak in their language. So I like looking at CFO-based frameworks, understanding how they're trying to quantify our capabilities, our return on investment for reducing risk or mitigating threats. And so it is something that I would encourage you it's not that long a read if you go download the TBM documentation and work through it. So now let's jump over to one of the two I talked about at the very beginning, Nist. So Nist is kind of a library of both cyber and other kind of documentations. And, at the highest level, you have the 800 series, which is great because it gives you enough detail to implement. It's a little frustrating sometimes because you'll look in there, some of the manuals are a little older. We know moving at cyber speed, you've got to get through these a lot quicker and update them a lot quicker, but still fundamentally very sound. There's a recent publication that came out around resiliency. There's another one around insider trust. It's not on this list, but Zero Trust documentation was published in the last 6 months. And so just if you're looking at encryption, if you're looking at all sorts of different things, they can give you great referenceable material. I will tell you that in the United States, FFIEC regulations are out of the Nist documentation in their framework. Specifically, a lot of that came out of that Nist special publication 837 on risk management for federal systems. So a great resource worth looking through and understanding when you can go, I'll just say it, plagiarize from them to accelerate your program. Other standards, Nist is very popular in the United States, but internationally, ISO 2700 series or framework, 2701 probably being the most popular, is the most common standard. So if you're going to do business internationally, I would focus more on ISO. And a lot of this, it's interesting. You come down and you look at FFIEC has, if you were to break that into a checklist, probably 270 some. PCI, you could break that down. It's, let's say 300. ISO 2701, a little over 100. So a lot of these, depending on which ones you want to do, you can really get in there and give yourself a checklist to measure your gaps against. ISO is also nice because you can have somebody come in and certify you on it, whereas NIST isn't quite as structured. And so it's easier to get an external audit. A great framework, unlike NIST, where you can just kind of go download those, you'll have to buy the standards for ISO, but I would tell you it's a worthwhile investment, in my opinion. Next is anybody using credit cards, you need to follow the payment card industry data security standards. These are really built to just make sure when the credit card is chip is put in, that the process between that chip and the bank closing out that transaction is all secure. And again, something you would bring in an auditor to validate. A couple other US standards that are good. And this is, I talk about this automation standard. This is more to let you know that depending on your industry, there may very well be a group that's come up with the cybersecurity requirements. There's for cloud, I think the Cloud Security Alliance is great. If you're in the United States, you may look at something like FedRAMP, which is a great set of requirements for the federal government to go into the cloud, but not something that you necessarily want to use. But again, good reference material. So that third bullet is just meant to say, whatever industry you're in, go do that research and discover who the cyber authorities are, who's created those best practices that you can leverage. I love that quote down there. All of this is talking about, we want trust. We want our employees' trust. We want our customers' trust. And that trust is built over years and lost under one incident. And that, depending on your case study, has had severe economic impacts. Next, I want to jump over and talk about some of the audit standards. There are a number of them out there. I've picked COBIT, the first one. It is done by an association. You can go buy, again, I'm showing you, I don't expect anybody to read that. You can go use that framework to build the program to validate your security program. And let's be honest, if the auditors are going to come inspect me by this, then this should be part of me designing my network. Again, I don't advocate taking a compliance framework and only building your standards and your infrastructure to meet that. It's not going to be a holistic program. It's going to be a compliant program and leave some uncovered risk. But as part of designing it, why wouldn't you take the audit standard that's going to be used against you and make sure it's weaved in, and then make the artifacts easy. When designing your programs, if you have a dashboard that you have to design the dashboard to present the evidence that you're going to need to pass an audit. It's just going to make everybody's life easier when they come in and they say, okay, I'm here for my annual or quarterly or however often audit. I want to see evidence that you've done a penetration test. I want to see evidence of your firewall updates. I want to see your patch management. And if you part of your processes are able to pull those out from historical rather than scrambling and trying to create stuff whole cloth, it's going to make everybody's a lot easier. And again, the second one around the American Institute, look for audit associations, belong to those kind of things. ISSA, great kind of organizations to get that broader community, and then pull those people in. You should have, you know, a friend in finance, a friend in accounting, a friend in audit that you can collaborate with as you build these programs. Next, I want to switch over. We've been talking about some bigger concepts. Let's drill down into some more functional requirements. And so the first is incident response, your security operations center, whatever you're calling it, your CERT, your SOC, a lot of different names out there. But those responsible for monitoring and reacting. I love the Nist incident response cycle, you know, prepare, detect. Once you detect something, have the response built to end up mitigating that, and then review lessons learned and put those back into your preparation. And so that constant cycle is a great process to build around. The next is Diamond. You can see a diagram down there. I really like this one for your threat intelligence team. You know, and there are a lot of different ones of these. You've got quad charts, you've got different acronyms to build this around. And so I like this as a way to think about who the adversary is, what they're attacking, how they're doing it, the infrastructure involved, and it ends up producing a nice report that's complete and gives you all the information you're likely to be asked about. Another one is this Stride. So Stride came out of Microsoft, and I think I've had the most success, or seen people have the most success with this around wargaming. It's a way to think about, you know, how to do the attack chain, and as you're doing a war game, to test whether or not something that was built or designed would survive an attack, a useful framework to use. And along that same, we have the kill chain, which is on this next slide. So it's a third bullet down. This is a similar thought process, but I put this one under vulnerability management because this is another area where we're constantly trying to figure out how to overcome this. What standard do we use? Do we just go buy a vulnerability scanner and then run that? And that really consists of all that we have. We don't have a program, we just have a tool running something, and that's it. Or do we say, you know, we want to pay attention to OWASP for our web vulnerabilities. We want to prioritize those that are being compromised most often. So we'll look for the CIS top 20, and by fixing these top 20 first, then we're fixing the things that are causing the most damage across the across our industry, or really across the internet. And so those are the things most commonly used to break in. We fix them first. And then finally, that kill chain. I love this because it talks about, you know, we always have that saying, we have to get lucky every time. The enemy only has to get lucky once. Well, not really. If we build this to stop their reconnaissance, so we have something at the edge, a WAF, web application firewall, blocking that reconnaissance, and then we minimize their ability to weaponize by minimizing our vulnerabilities. We have situational awareness monitoring. So through whatever means, our SIM is collecting data, and we see that attack as it's delivered or as it tries to exploit. We have endpoint protections looking for something being installed. We have a secure web gateway looking for outbound traffic to intercept that command and control, or somebody clicking on a phishing email. There are a lot of times we can intercept and interrupt everything they have to get right to compromise our network. So again, it's just a way to think about, as we protect, as we measure our vulnerabilities, where are we doing this at a programmatic level with the strategy? So we've talked about a lot of things. Let's talk about what we can do with this. So kind of around our next step is, do I have anything that's actually mandatory? Do I have laws, regulations? PCI is not necessarily a law or regulation, but it's an industry mandated standard. What do I have to do? That's just table stakes. We've got to get that done first and foremost. Next, then what is specific to my industry? Am I in finance? Am I in commerce? Is there something unique? Because as I look at that, I may be in gaming, and right now gaming is under a huge wave of denial of service attacks. And so, that may affect what models I use, what tools I use. I may be looking for some threat sharing community that helps me collaborate. The next thing I want to do is I want to look at risk the way the leadership of the company looks at risk. So if there's a risk committee or an audit committee, how do my auditors present risk? How do they talk about it? Are they using numbers? Are they using heat maps? Because I want to build the way I talk about risk to the senior leaders in a similar fashion rather than try to retrain them to think about cyber risk using a different format. And so I want to see where I can parallel and leverage things that are already being done. The next thing I want to do is I want to lock in a framework that will work for me. Ideally, one framework. I may have an overarching framework, and then a sub-framework for my security operations center, a sub for my threat intelligence team, a sub for my red team. And we talked about some of those examples. And so there may be some nested frameworks, and that's fine. And then I want to start to understand how to document that hierarchy. So it's a repeatable process, and it's not driven by a person, but it's driven by the maturity of the program. Once that's done, I want to get stakeholder buy-in. I want to get, finance for the budget, auditors, IT, my leadership. I just need to get everybody on board, because we all know culture eats strategies for breakfast. And so you got to get everybody on board, moving in the same direction. Finally, once you have everybody agreed on that framework, consider getting an external assessment. So you get somebody else's view, because I know I'm personally blind to some of the things I think I'm doing well. You want to build out a risk register or risk radar, however you do it. You want to document those gaps. You want to look at your technical debt and figure out what you need to address up front. These are areas where some of those analyst frameworks like SASE may be helpful. And then you want to publish that plan and address it, or put things into your risk register as you accept those issues. So, that's just kind of the journey that you have to go on for a framework. And so with that, I want to thank you for your time. I hope this has been useful. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out, and I'm looking forward to engaging. Thanks all. Bye.